between the top of his fist and the tip of its tongue, while completely ignoring the enormous body that was working its way heavily onto his own body now. And Bennett, who was wet with sweat and the water that the snake had brought on board, was laughing. There, on his back, pinned like a wrestler in an unsporting match, he roared with the powerful joy while he tried to work one hand upwards with the assistance of the other hand. Easter, ever helpful, grabbed onto the lower half of their guest and tried to pull it off his friend. There was too much coiling and uncoiling for an accurate measurement, but the snake appeared to be 15 feet long, 18 when it stretched. Bennett appeared to be 5 feet, 5 inches long, and was outweighed by as much as 50 pounds. The three doctors pressed away, screaming various invectives in an unhelpful language. Morena wanted to jump in the water and run across the lettuce with the long-toed birds, but who could say that the snake didn't have a family down there? There was an odor that none of them recognized, the smell of furious reptile, an oily stench of putrid rage that sunk into the membranes of their nostrils as if it planned to stay there forever. The back half of the snake whipped around and made itself a knot around Easter's slender waist. At the moment the head swung back, Easter reached into the air, his hand a quarter second faster than the snake, and grabbed the throat just below the head, well above Bennett's fist. Easter had caught the snake that Bennett had caught. Oh, the whooping, the triumph, and the revelry. They shook the jungle with their screams, Bennett and Easter, for sure enough, Easter was screaming, and the sound was so piercing, so much like the agony of death, that all three doctors were sure that the boy had been bitten, and they lunged forward with the instinct of decency to save his life. But Easter was grinning madly as he gripped the snake, while Bennett, who was considerably stronger, held fast below. They looked into the creature's mouth now like a carnival attraction, while the tongue, that silvered spark of light, licked towards them. "It's an anaconda," Alan said. "He caught an anaconda with his hands." Alan's Saturn seemed to be at the perfect intersection of the thrilling achievement of the Lakashi, the terror of Morena and his wife, and the rage of the snake, whose eyes had focused into 2 pinpoints of murderous desire. Easter coughed. Maybe Morena understood it before he did, but of course that would be impossible to say. In a moment, everything was clear to her, and she stepped through the wall of her own revulsion and fear and took the tail end of the snake that was pressed into Easter's hip. Its flesh was at once clammy and dry, cool despite the terrible heat of the day. She had once dissected a snake in a college biology class, a small black garter snake, long dead and stinking of formaldehyde. She had cut it down the center and pinned it open on a wax-bottom pan. To the best of her memory, it was the only snake she had ever touched. She touched the second one while she worked to pull it from the boy. When she had pried a little of it loose, she moved her hands up the body, hand over hand, like she was working her way up a rope, except the end of the rope began to wrap around her wrist. It was a muscle like nothing she had ever encountered. It did not fight against her. It did not notice her. She pulled. Easter coughed again. Bennett could see the problem as well. His friend was wrapped inside the snake, and the snake had figured out a way to loosen the hand that held its neck. Bennett slid his hand up to cover Easter's hand just as Easter's hand fell away. Easter tried to work his own small hands between himself and the snake, and when he exhaled to get just his fingertips in between them, the snake felt the movement of his breath and squeezed. Easter's eyes shot first to Morena, and there she saw the very soul of him in his fear. And Morena's hands were behind Alan's hands, and they were pulling together, all of them, Bennett from the throat, while Nancy Saturn cried for a knife, and then Jacques. But Bennett could not hear her now. He was frozen to the snake, who was in the business of killing his friend, who may have been 11 or 12, but was very small for his age. "Tell me there is a knife on this boat," Nancy said. Easter's lips were turning blue, either from the lack of the oxygen or the weight of the snake. He went down on his knees. It occurred to Morena that his spine could snap. They all went down on their knees. Morena knew there was a machete strapped to the steering column of the boat, the knife that Easter had used to trim away the branches to tie the boat to the tree. In an instant, she was up. The knife was nearly as long as her arm, heavy as a tennis racket, and she put the blade just above Bennett's fist and with a single pass sliced off the head. And it would have been the greatest moment of her life had slicing off the head killed the snake. But the beheading changed nothing. On the deck, the busy head continued to snap its murderous teeth, moving in a slow circle while the jaw opened and closed, while its body went about the business of strangling the boy. "Jesus," she said. She could see the tendons standing out on Bennett's neck. She could see his crooked bottom teeth, his open jaw pushing forward in exertion, the blood of the headless snake running down his arm. While Bennett continued to pull the top of the snake, the Saturns continued to pull the bottom, and in the middle, Easter continued his death. Morena began to saw into the rolls of headless snake, her hand at Easter's head and the point of the machete at Easter's toes. Her objective was to cut through both coils simultaneously, as she doubted there would be time to do this twice. At no point did Easter make a sound. He would not use another teaspoon of his breath. He stayed stock still inside this jacket and kept his eyes on Morena. First, there was a large vertebral column that required Morena to lean in as she sawed, as much as she would have to lean in to saw apart a human arm with a long knife at a bad angle. She had worried about pressing in too hard and cutting Easter, but Easter was still very far away. She cracked the vertebra in the first coil and then worked the knife from side to side to break the second bend. And then she cut through the ribs, the thick muscles that ran down the belly scoot, the cloaca. When she was very close to Easter, she put the knife down and ripped the bit of snake that was left with her hands. The heavy weight of the snake worked in her favor then, tearing itself as it fell to the deck. Nancy Saturn picked up the boy, light as air, this child, and stretched him out beside his murderer and blew into his mouth and blew. Her lips reined in to cover so small a mouth. With one hand behind his neck, she tilted back his head, and with the other hand, she blocked his nose, and she blew until she saw his chest rise, and none of them could tell whose breath it was. And she stopped for a minute, and it was his, shallow and uneven at first, but his own. She lifted up his shirt and lightly touched the red welts across his torso, and Alan Saturn kneeled beside her and put his ear to Easter's chest. Bennett crouched away from them, his head against his knees, his back heaving with his breath, while on the other side of the boat, Easter's eyes blinked open. Morena sat down beside him then in the pool of widening blood and took his hand. It was still daylight when they got back. Alan Saturn was driving the boat, and even though there were a couple dozen of the Lakashi waiting on shore, the branches in their hands had not been lit. When they saw the boat, they stood up to watch, but they didn't jump or cry out. It could have been because the travelers had only been gone for half a day, and it could have been because Dr. Saturn was not among them. Either way, everyone on the boat was relieved, though there was more to celebrate now than there had been in all their lives combined. But when Alan Saturn pulled up next to the little dock and the Lakashi came on board the boat, the calling and the crying broke forward in earnest, not the theatrical display of a week before, but a deep and abiding joy that Morena had not seen. 3 men picked up the 3 large chunks of the snake from the blood-slicked deck, and the 4th man picked up the head, the very head Morena had meant to kick into the water, even though she had been unwilling to touch it again, even with her foot. They carried off the pieces of the snake, each as heavy as a small tree, and hoisted them about their heads to show the ebullient crowd. It would be a feast to tell the grandchildren about for years to come. There would be anaconda for dinner tonight. And that is that. Thank you. My hat's off to those of you who were able to finish your dessert while I was doing that. Most of you had the fork just like this. It's such a disgusting scene, but and the whole book is not like that at all. But I have to say, having been on book tour, you know, for the last 20 years of my life, seriously, it's the first time I've ever had a scene from a book where everybody is like, the horror is so satisfying. Okay, so this is a story that I'm going to tell you. I went to the Amazon to do research when I was about halfway through writing this book. The way I do research is I like to write the scene pretty much and then go backwards and go to the place and see what I need to see. Because if I do my research up front, I never get around to writing the book. Because research is really fun and writing is really a drag. So when I was at the point where I was writing the Amazon scenes, I certainly hadn't finished the book. I went to the Amazon, compliments of my beloved gourmet magazine that used to let me go anywhere I wanted to go for any reason. And I single-handedly bankrupt Gourmet Magazine with my travel expenses. And it wasn't that I wasn't willing to pay for my own travel. It was that I never had any idea how to book these trips. If you want to go on a really obscure jungle trip to the Amazon, I don't know about you, but I don't have a clue how to do that unless I'm going to go on one of those A&K tours with a whole bunch of people. So anyway, we were on a boat. It was a very nice boat, my husband and I, that had about 12 rooms on it. And every day they would put the guests into 2 open skiffs that were about 12 or 15 feet long with an outboard motor. There would be 8 or 10 of us in a boat. And they would take us down these tributaries for hours and hours and hours. And you'd go right and left and left and left and right and left. And you'd just think, God, if the guy running the motor has a heart attack or something, we are quite literally up the creek. And there was a moment one of these days where we were in a lettuce pond and we hadn't seen another living soul for probably 4 hours, and one of the guests, I would like to underline guests, held up his hand and said, stop the boat, and said, wait, a little to the left, a little to the right, and he pulls a 15-foot anaconda into this tiny open boat. And I am actually not afraid of snakes, but I really wanted to get out of the boat. And there was no place to go. You can't go ashore in the Amazon. It's like water, plant life. And the plant life is like a cinder block wall. There's no shore, there's no entrance into it. And this man, who, as it turns out, I did not know at the time, was named Greg Greer, kept the anaconda on the boat for about 20 minutes and gave us all a fascinating lecture about anacondas. And it turns out this guy was a professional naturalist, and he went all over the world picking up everything that you ought not pick up. He knew the name of every bird, every plant. He was really incredible. He showed us the inside of the mouth and explained that the jaws didn't have hinges, and showed us the teeth and the smell of an anaconda. Oh, like you cannot believe what this thing smells like. Something a skunk has never even aspired to. We all had to just throw away the clothes we were wearing and smelled it for days and days. But what was great is Greg became a real friend of mine, and he became my naturalist fact checker on this book. So when I originally wrote this scene, which I obviously wrote after this particular adventure in the Amazon, I had Morena killing the snake with a scalpel, because I thought there would be like a medical kit on board, and that's what she would find, and she would kill it with a scalpel. And Greg told me that would be a little bit like taking your thigh off with an X-Acto knife. And that the blade would last for about 30 seconds. And that it had to be a machete, and that there would be a sharp machete on the boat. and that you would have to cut through both coils. So this is